Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the Leveling Up Developer Velocity panel. My name is Ken Rose. I am the co-founder and CTO at OpsLevel, and I'm going to be the moderator today. Um, Quick aside, OpsLevel is an internal developer portal that helps engineering teams quickly ship quality software. Now, before we bring on our amazing panelists, I just want to run through a couple of quick housekeeping items. So the first is today's panel will be recorded, and we are going to be sending out a copy of the recording to everybody afterwards. We also are going to have some time for all of our panelists at the end. If you do have a question, please use the Q&A section, which should be on the right-hand side. There's also an upvote mechanism for questions. So if you see a question that really resonates with you, please upvote it, and that's going to help us determine the sort of priority that we can ask the questions in. We do have some limited time, so depending on how many questions we get, it might not be possible for our panelists to answer all of them. But anything we can't sort of answer live here on the panel, we'll definitely take back to our panelists and see if we can get some of their thoughts and send those out afterwards with the recording. Finally, we would love to know just who is in the audience today. So please feel free to leave a brief intro message in the chat, just saying who you are, where you work, and where in the world you are calling from. And with that, I think we now have all of our panelists here. So let me do some quick introductions. So first up, we have Chris Evans. Chris is the co-founder and chief product officer at Incident.io, an incident management company that helps organizations improve how they learn from and respond to incidents. And prior to this, he was technical director of platform and reliability at Monzo, a UK-based bank where he spearheaded on-call and incident management. These days, as a co-founder, I am sure he wears many hats and works across Incident.io's commercial, product, and engineering teams. We also have Eli Daniel, who is head of engineering at Jellyfish. He leads all their efforts to develop their software products that provide engineering management insights, enable engineering leaders and managers to measure, improve, and communicate the investment and effectiveness of their team's effort. He comes to Jellyfish by way of 25 years in the Boston tech scene, having seen both successful exits and some smoldering craters, but which have led to a keen interest in what makes successful product development teams go. And finally, we have Rob Zuber. Rob is the CTO at CircleCI, a continuous integration and delivery platform that automates software builds, tests, and deployments. He is a 25-year veteran of software startups, a 3-time founder, a 5-time CTO, and I don't even know how many guitars he owns, but we've lost count at this point. Since joining CircleCI, Rob has seen the company through its Series F funding and delivered on product innovation at scale while leading a globally distributed engineering team. Gentlemen, great to have you all here.
Thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
So why don't we dive right in, right? The title of this panel is Leveling Up Developer Velocity. I'd love to just open with, how do you folks think about defining developer velocity?
It's a race to see who's going to go first. I'll wait.
Go for it, Rob.
I'll weigh in. Yeah, why not? So, first of all, I'm a big fan of lowercase letters, if that makes sense. Like we talk, because when you say velocity, right, a lot of times that turns into story points, and we're a Scrum shop, and like every single one of these words has some hidden meaning about what you're talking about. And I think we want to get away from all that and talk about, are we able to effectively deliver as an engineering team, as a product team, right? And I'm using the product definition of product manager plus designer plus engineers. Like, can we go solve business problems when we understand those problems? And can we do that effectively with minimum overhead in order to achieve that, right? And I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about like metrics and how that plays into other things. But ultimately what matters as a business leader is, can we solve business problems? Can we deliver value to our customers? Can we deliver value to the business? And can we do that with the minimum amount of sort of overhead and impediment?
Eli, anything to add? You might be muted, by the way.
You'd think I'd know how to do this by now. I was just going to say, the other aspect of that is how quickly. Obviously, the word velocity connotes, speed, and part of it is, what is the measure, and how do you talk about how quickly you can have that business impact? Sometimes mixed in is how fast are the pieces working? How much code are we writing? How many PRs are getting merged? How quickly do we deploy? Things like that. But I think at the end of it, it's really about how much business value comes through the chute, how quickly.
Yeah, I think worth also, I think the way I think of like developer velocity, and like I agree with you, Rob, in terms of like lowercase versions of this kind of thing in the general case. It's like, how quickly are we going and in what direction, which to sort of not to get overly sort of, mathematical about the sort of velocity thing. But like, I think this is, good developer velocity looks like people shooting in the right direction and able to get there very quickly without a lot of like overheads. And like overheads is probably an interesting area to probe into, because I think that's where, when you pull back from like individual developers and you start looking at teams, that's where productivity really starts to be something that kind of comes to the fore. When you start thinking about like, well, I can have one engineer and they can ship at a certain amount of velocity, and then when you go, well, I'll scale that and I'll turn that into a team of 5 engineers, it starts to, like, you obviously don't get 5 times exactly the productivity. Sometimes you might get more, actually. Sometimes you might get less, and it's sort of interesting to probe, I think, into like what good team productivity looks like in that regard. When you factor in like person-to-person communication and like things going wrong and sharing knowledge amongst people and all of the other factors that kind of that come into play there.
Awesome. So, the thrust of the answers I've heard is it's more about alignment to business impact, this idea of being able to operate with minimal overhead, directionality. Chris, I really like, I guess, the idea of like velocity as a vector. So it's kind of like if there's a magnitude and a direction. How do you folks think, some of the challenge I could imagine there is that that's sort of squishy. We talk about business impact. Like, how do you folks think about actually measuring some of that to know if that directionality is correct, or being able to quantify or qualitatively understand what that overhead is? What are some ways you folks have thought about measuring some of those outputs?
I can share how we think about this at Incident.io. So I think the first thing is like, we're not very scientific about it, and it is not like here's the graph or the number or the metric that we look at and things like that. But for us, for example, like productivity of like a product team is kind of measured. It's going to sound very, very sort of like pithy, but it's measured in kind of vibes back from customers and like the level of customer love and the sort of, I think you can assess really strongly how productive you are based on like the feedback and sort of the fit that you have with your markets, your customers, right? And so that doesn't necessarily mean they all just tell you they love it. It can also mean that they tell you they hate things. And it's like, it's, you want either end of that spectrum is like a good place where you feel like your team has been productive. Either you're getting, this is basically the people who care are the people who are going to tell you, right? And they care a lot and it's terrible, or they care a lot and it's brilliant. And so that is I think a really solid like heuristic. I guess it's not very scientific, but it is a good one, certainly for a company of our size, to sort of measure, are the right things happening? Is the team being productive, and how we're doing that? Like there's obviously like a myriad of things underneath that. Is like, how do we measure how productive they are? Is it like the quantity of those things? It's probably not. It's like, again, a feel and a steer from us of like, do we feel like we are getting the right levels of value out of a product team shipping unit kind of thing? But yeah, I don't know, Eli, Rob, whether you have anything more sophisticated than that at the scales you're operating at.
It's disappointing to find out. Oh, go ahead, Rob. All right, I'll start, and then we'll see what happens. I was going to say, is it disappointing to find out not really? Like, I think the important point is that separation, right, of outputs and outcomes, and both matter, right? Because in order to drive outcomes, we need to be able to create some output. Typically, we want to make sure it's the right thing. We want to make sure we're aligned on something that's going to drive business value. We want to be checking in and getting feedback. Like, all of those things matter. And measuring that, like, I think there's lots of well-known metrics, which we'll probably get into at some point in terms of how people measure the efficiency of delivery, right? But the kind of the superpower in productivity, if you will, is delivering the right thing, not just delivering anything. And that comes down to, or how are we moving the needle for our customers, right? Like, a lot of that is feedback. It might be that sort of qualitative, customers are telling me they love it or hate it. Obviously, at scale, you have the more quantitative, like people are using it, not using it, it's driving the needle, there's adoption, all of those things. And I think if we sometimes separate engineering too much into just the outputs, like I think I see that happen, by we, I mean in the industry. And when engineers are really aligned around and understand the outcomes that we're trying to drive, like this is the thing we're trying to get adopted. And it's not like we build a thing and then we market it, and marketing is about adoption, but adoption is about people loving it and wanting to use it and seeing that actually take up. That's when you start to get real, just much higher, call it productivity, in quotes, but like delivery of business value, because we really understand what the customer needs and we can shortcut our way there.
Eli, I'd also love your take, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, the thing I would add is maybe just a middle level in between. There's sort of raw productivity in the sense of busyness, how hard are people working and how much stuff is being done. There's the ultimate business outcomes, to the point of understanding what KPIs for the thing you're trying to build and what success looks like, what you're playing for, and getting teams very engaged in that. But the middle one in between those we find really useful to look at is just allocation of time. Like how much of the team's time is going into the strategic stuff that you're chasing versus how much is kind of reacting to things, keeping the lights on, keeping the business running. And that doesn't, having a good balance there doesn't mean that you're winning. You could certainly have your time going into stuff that turns out to not be very effective or not achieving the business outcomes that you want. But it is necessary. Like if you're not able to pick a strategy and go devote enough of your attention to the strategy that you're picking, that it certainly holds you back. So I think that's the other one I would introduce as an important foundation.
I really like that for what it's worth. That's something that we think about a lot, which is if you want to try and measure how productive a team is, there's like the sort of the way you do that where you go, well, what are they shipping? What is the value and everything like that? Or you can go, well, if I assume that a team that is like unencumbered by any kind of reactive work or whatever else is like 100% productive, then the way that you can look at how productive the time is of a team is to sort of take away the negative stuff, which is like how much time is spent when things go wrong, how much time is spent on like coordination costs, and those things tend to be a lot more tractable to kind of actually track. And so if you want to look at this kind of middle ground you're talking about, you can often get there just by subtracting essentially total capacity, minus your sort of reactive stuff. Tends to be quite interesting.
So it sounds like, there's very much like, again, a business focus and a focus on delivering value. How do you folks communicate that to your team? Like, does everybody on your teams understand like this is the bar that they're being measured, or how should engineering leaders think about like communicating what the actual like output and outcomes are?
We certainly try to have. Oh, go ahead.
No, sorry. You go for it. Like,
I think my connection's a little unstable here, so there's a little lag. I apologize for that. I was going to say, we certainly try to have our teams very engaged in that. What is the outcome that we're playing for? And in fact, get our engineering product design leaders on the teams be the voice of identifying and setting up and communicating outwards to the rest of the org on what that is. So I would say that is our kind of foundation, is making sure that teams are fluent in that. Now, can every engineer always really understand it all the way up and down through its sophistication? Maybe not. We'd like to aspire to that, but I'd say that's an area that we're always trying to push on doing more.
Yeah, I mean, from our side, we sort of like deliberately have called our like engineers here. All engineers here are product engineers, and so they are very. It's not like we're not the kind of, the PM thinks about the customer and how to market the thing and how to get things out into the world. And the engineers are like delivery units of like fingers on keyboards with headphones on. I think we do an awful lot to try and connect the two. So the sort of, I guess the sort of the way to sort of like, I think about it is I kind of reject the premise of, in our organization of like, who is it that, how do I communicate the value to people? Is I don't think I need to in the sort of same way as I have, and I have historically had to do that. But like our engineering teams are very connected to, for example, revenue. And so they'll be like, great, well, we want to build the things that are going to be most successful for the company. And so that looks like building things people want and then caring about those things getting adopted and sunsetting the things that people don't want and haven't adopted because they are like a tax on all future sort of engineering effort. And I think when you get to that world and you have engineers routinely talking to customers, you get to this world where they sort of, I don't know, it helps to develop a kind of intuition and a muscle across the whole organization. So you sort of, I guess, remove that need for like, we've done a great job, people. Everyone can kind of intuit it from the day-to-day signals and feedback that they get of like how they just normally work.
That's awesome. Yeah, it sounds like really you're building a culture where empathy is really grounded in each and every person. They're able to then have a lot of autonomy and make kind of good decisions independently based on that.
Yeah, and like, I mean, I'm not naive. Like, I think scaling this stuff is probably where it gets really interesting. And I mean, fortunate enough that we don't have to, I can just punt that to be like future Chris problem. But like for right now, it works really well. And it might not work at all scales. And I can certainly think of like organizations I've worked in the past where you just wouldn't have been able to do that. So I know it's not a sort of one size fits all, fits all, and everyone should just do this. But it definitely works at some scales and is working at our scale.
I think one of the key points of scaling for future Chris, I guess, is like finding ways to continue to break the problems down into, places where, maybe in a very large organization, a team might not own everything, but can own a piece of that and still really connect to the customer on that piece of it. And as opposed to, you know, pushing that kind of decision making up higher where all of that falls apart. Like, I think you absolutely want to maintain that connection with the customer. I was just thinking about who's on the panel, and one of the things that we, you know, it's a double-edged sword, but that we benefit from is we're building tools for developers. So engineers tend to be a little more connected to their customer. One of the things that has been the big role of product in our organization is casting the sort of lens a little bit wider, or like the perspective a little bit wider, because we have a way of doing things as an engineering team, but that's not how every engineering team functions. And so really collecting like what is the scope of how people want to do this effectively, so we can have people connected to that, which is like it's an interesting challenge to face, right? I don't know, hopefully no one listening to this will be surprised when I say that engineers are pretty opinionated about how you should do things, but they're opinionated about their way, and that's not the way, you know, different people have different contexts, right? Like Chris talked about working at a bank previously. Not everyone's at a bank, and banks have to do specific things because of regulatory reasons and whatever. And so those different contexts, I think, are really important to bring in. And we do a lot of that just through sharing customer stories, right? Like, we want to have our engineers talk to customers directly as much as possible. That's not always possible. And they might talk to a specific customer who has a very specific view, and trying to create that broader lens, right? Like, yes, that's right for that customer, but here's how we have to think about the solution that will help many different customers. Yes, we want to guide them towards what we believe are better practices, but in their context, right? So how can we share that context, enough of that context, with folks to really understand? Because they can project themselves into it once they hear the details a little bit, and storytelling and narrative is really valuable there.
Totally. I love, you know, so it sounds like then the main output really, again, is like the business outcome and the business impact. Are we building things? Are our teams building things that align with what our customers expect? And are we delivering value, and that's helping our business grow? To that, you know, we kind of touched on this idea of can we remove those blockers and the things that kind of get in the way? I'd love to understand, what are some of the challenges that you folks have seen that can help, that actually contribute to slowing down product development teams? Maybe Chris, if you want to go first.
Yeah. Things that I've seen slow. I guess a couple of things come to mind. So I guess like I've seen a lot of like engineering teams and product teams get slowed down by like over processification of some things, and that can kind of manifest, I think, in a few different ways. So like a clear way that probably I've seen like many times is people have like an over reliance on data, and like they undervalue like intuition and gut, and that what that manifests as in like terms of like productivity slowdown is like the product manager or the engineers want to go and talk to all the customers to get the feedback on the thing before they build the thing, and I'm like, do you think you have a good intuition here? And like, if you sort of were to look at this as a more global problem, like if you shipped a thing that was like more opinionated based on your own experience, and you got it in the hands of customers and they gave you like feedback, would that lead to a better outcome in the same time frame than going and asking them in the first place what they wanted and how they wanted it solved, and sort of you get to the end? So if you look at those two time frames, my sort of gut on this is, I think generally people are really terrible at articulating their wants and needs and things like that. And so you go and ask people, I mean, you know, the classic like faster horse quote, whoever it's attributed to, but like that is like a real thing. And I think what I've seen work certainly at our scale and beyond where I've been in other organizations is this kind of idea of shipping things quickly based on like small amounts of data and a bit of extrapolation fueled by like gut and intuition, and then people giving you feedback and telling you where it's wrong or it doesn't fit actually is a really good workflow for being fast. And so yeah, anyway, that sort of, I've gone off track a bit, but that is a thing I've seen slowing people down. And then I think the other stuff that is like more obvious stuff is teams that kind of die on like their amount of productivity they can ship because of the 1,000 paper cuts that they accumulate of things that slow them down. So whether it's bits of process or it's technical debt, or it's like, you know, we are inundated by reactive work on this product, those sorts of things, you know, and teams end up in this loop of being distracted, firefighting all of the time. Very clear, like very different kind of solution to that kind of problem of like, you know, there's different levers you might want to pull in that thing, and there's probably a million different like ways I could take that. But like, I'll pause. Those are a couple of things I've seen sort of slowing people down.
That's interesting, Chris. It's also interesting, right? Because I'm contrasting that to what Rob just said, and it sounds like there's probably some happy medium where, you know, Rob, you pointed out one challenge, you don't want to have opinion engineers kind of impart too much of their viewpoint on the world. And Chris, you're saying actually that can be useful as a faster mechanism for product delivery.
Yes, both.
Yeah,
I find.
right. I think the balance is, if you're just saying this is how I would do it, that might, like, this, every software delivery organization should function the way that I believe they should function, right? Like, that's going to run you into some limitations. But saying I need to go talk to every single software delivery organization before I design and deliver a thing, you're never going to build anything, right? And so, because I very much agree with Chris's point, like, you're trying to make sure that you're looking with a broad view to say, okay, we're trying to solve this for this population. I also think, like, as a product, as a company delivering a product, having an opinion, which is, again, not super constrained, but we believe that customers who operate in this way are great customers for us, and customers who operate in this way are not great customers for us, and then we're comfortable with that, I think is really important, right? Like, we have an identity, we have an approach, and if you don't believe in that approach, we are not going to go build something completely different just to get you as a customer, kind of thing. Like, I think it's important to understand what your opinion is and just have that not be, there's only one way to do something. Like, again, I know some engineers, I am an engineer, there's only one way to do this, and every other way those people should just stop doing that. Like, that's not a great way to think about building tools for anybody in any space, right? But the other thing that I really think Chris is highlighting in there is kind of the fear, right? I mean, maybe not expressed to that extreme, but I'm nervous about being wrong. Therefore, I'm going to try to get more data, more information, talk to more people, whatever. And the thing that I say ad nauseum, and I don't think it really lands with as many folks as I want it to, is we are wrong. Like, just accept that as a starting point. We don't know what we're wrong about. We don't know how wrong we are, and we're not going to know how to get to right until we put something in the hands of customers and they start reacting to it, right? Like, to Chris's point about just put it out there, get some information. Now you have something to work with, because all of the conversations, all of the whatever, like, it is expensive to build software. So how do you put something out there quickly? Like, what's the smallest thing that you can get into the hands of customers? And that might be simple prototypes, and like, there's lots of ways of dealing with that. But getting real feedback on real ideas compared to, collecting data, going on sort of, whatever, on, vast explorations before doing work, is a great way to burn a bunch of time and not really deliver anything of value.
Back to the idea of lowercase letters, it sounds a lot like lowercase a agile, like the idea of like iterative development and biasing towards quick releases and getting feedback versus trying to, articulate everything that the world could want and then, front loading all that.
I have so many reactions to that particular word.
I was worried if I said the A word that it was going to, like, there's a whole Pandora's box we're going to go
down. I think one of the things I spent a lot of time thinking about, and we spend time talking about and trying to make, leverage is what Marty Kagan describes as a dual track, right? And there's other ways of expressing it, but basically, like, this is a thing we're doing discovery on. We're trying to understand what the right solution is, but we have ways of moving that forward. This is, like, well understood, and we're delivering. And sometimes we deliver in order to discover, and sometimes at CircleCI, but I see this all the time in the industry as well, meaning, like, let's build a really big, complex thing to find out that we're wrong. That's not usually a good way to go about it, right? There's a difference between, what we describe as 0 to 1. This is a brand new idea. We're trying to get some feedback on it. What are the quick ways to get that feedback and data, but, like, real reactions? This is like, sometimes we're just making something scale better, right? We don't need to go talk to a bunch of customers about whether or not they want it to be robust. We just make it robust. You know what I mean? Like, those things we already know, and we're improving and iterating on.
I think this ties neatly into, like, the concept of an MVP, which is, I think everyone who's worked in the vicinity of product teams will know what an MVP is by sort of, like, name. But I think this is actually, is one of the things I spend most of my time trying to align teams around. Is, like, it's really hard to figure out what an MVP is, and I'm sure we've all seen the comics of, like, skateboards to cars to whatever else it is, and it's like, I think, and, like, building a good MVP is actually really hard. And even scoping what like the V of that MVP means. It is not build a crappy version of your product and then get crappy feedback where people tell you all the obvious things. It's like building the sort of the neatest, tightest vertical that gives you the maximal surface area for someone to sort of like intuit and spot and in their mind extrapolate what the full version of that product looks like. And then they go, oh my God, like I can see this future. And like, what if this did this and this bit went here? And like, we had this here and we layered AI. And it's like, that's what you need to, I think what you need to get to with product teams is like, if they can get to that point, then that process of shipping to get the feedback, that's where the sort of the magic happens, I think. And I think there's like all the myriad of other ways where that fails, where you ship a terrible MVP, or you know, as Rob points out, you build with all your own biases and you think you're right, and then you're not willing to kind of take the feedback, or you've sort of gone well beyond the MVP stage. So I don't know, I think this is like one of those things I could probably write, you know, several blog posts on, is like how I think about MVPs. But I think it is like such a critical function of like healthy product teams shipping in that sort of lowercase a agile way, basically.
Chris, you also used the word vertical there. Actually, I think I might appropriate that or rebrand MVP as the minimal like vertical product instead of the minimum viable product.
There you go. Yeah. Sounds smart. You can claim it as like Kenneth's Law or something. You know, I think
it'll be Evan's Law, because it was you who named it. Eli, I'd love to get your take on something here as well. Like one major drawback, right, that I've always seen, and this is a classic tension, is like, when does a team work on technical debt and when should they be working on their product roadmap? And I'd love to get your take on strategies you've seen effective in terms of balancing technical debt investment versus kind of product delivery.
Yeah, I think the fully realized version of this, and the thing that I strive for in a good mature team, is actually maybe the distinction doesn't even register too much. Like, and I kind of like to avoid the word technical debt, think of it as a category of stuff. And instead, it's just all about business value and product delivery value. And sometimes the best way to get value is to clear the ground and sharpen your tools and do the stuff to let you do things better. Sometimes the best way is to use your sharp tools to go build the thing that you're trying to build. And finding that right balance is just part of the opportunity, discovery, et cetera, space that I would like teams to be owning and doing. Now, that's kind of idealistic. It doesn't always work that way. And so the other tactic sometimes is to just carve out a percentage of your time, make it clear that the right answer is not zero investment in your own internal tooling and efficiency. Spend 10% of your time, 15% of the time, pick a number. And sometimes doing that just gives people who otherwise feel pressured, either they're not allowed to or inclined to, rat hole on things for the sake of technical purity. They're like, just setting some number can often be a way to get people out of that balance. But my real philosophical answer is don't. Like, it's really just all investment in business value at the end of the day. And the more you can get people thinking of it that way and being able to speak, as an engineer, not go, hey, product person, buzz off, this isn't your business, we just have to do it this way. But instead bring the, hey, product person, this is really important because this is actually accelerating adoption of our thing, because we'll be able to build XYZ things faster over the next 2 months if we do this. In a way that it kind of brings it all into the space of value delivery.
Awesome. Megan just pointed out we have about 10 minutes left, and there's a question that I am actually chomping at the bit to ask you three. No doubt, like, there's been an explosion in AI and LLM tooling in the last year. The 2024 DORA report came out, though, and kind of commented on the fact that though there is an increase in adoption of these types of tools, there actually hasn't been much increase in productivity as a result of using it. In fact, there's been some sort of negative correlations with using these types of tools. I'd love to get your take, though. Like, what has been your experience with integrating different tooling around using AI and LLMs across your development teams, and how what's your experience been? Maybe, I don't know, Rob, if you want to go first.
I have a lot to say, but
sorry, Rob. Eli, if you want to take the. Yeah.
So I actually think that these tools are a big productivity boost. We're seeing that ourselves, and we actually are seeing that so Jellyfish, for those who don't know, is a product that measures a whole bunch of stuff about your engineering teams. And so one of the things we do is actually be able to look at, like, in the numbers, what are the differences as you adopt these different tools. We're actually seeing overall generally meaningful increases certainly in like output production. It's different, of course, depending on different kinds of teams. And I would say more mundane, more rote work, it tends to really, really accelerate. Things that are bottlenecked more by, the human discovery of what do we even need here or what moves things forward, like in AI, does not typically speed up that stuff very much. But I actually am more bullish than maybe the conventional wisdom is here on the impact that these things are having. I think we really are seeing it already.
I'd say a couple things. We actually just did we have a newsletter, CircleCI, which you can find on LinkedIn, where we did something on kind of looking at builds going through our system and trying to associate. Obviously there's some methodology to try to figure out, what of this was generated, and there's some interesting stuff in there. I won't go into it, but I would say one of the more interesting parts of this debate for me is actually thinking about what engineers do on a day-to-day basis, right? Because when we talk about AI tools, we spend a lot of time talking about code generation. And I don't know that the typing is the hardest part of software development. We've talked a lot about understanding the business problem, knowing what it is that you're trying to achieve. Like the time that we spend, thinking about what we should build, designing it, all of those things. I think ideally that's where we could spend more time, but it is actually where we spend a bunch of time right now, right? Like there were some early numbers that came out that were like, I won't quote them, but massive increase in productivity, but it was increase in executing the specific task of typing a very specific thing into an editor, which sure, that's helpful, but particularly I think senior engineers and junior engineers also see this differently, right? So like stepping back and thinking about that, I then ask the question, like, where will I get the biggest boost, right? And sometimes it's understanding how some third-party tool works, and I can get really rapid access to information, summaries of all the things, like just pointers to even where I would look to understand these things in a way that can be really helpful, or like stubbing out an API interaction that is just me reading docs and getting frustrated because I can't find the reference to the type of a particular field, like those problems. But that is a small piece of what we do, I think, in engineering. And so what I'm more excited about, which I haven't seen as much of as yet, is the where in these other sort of areas of toil, the things that keep us from being in the editor writing code, right? Like, and I'm not calling design toil, but there's like those buckets, right? Like, how do I get this thing, whatever, through the process? How do I, understand these other parts of my system that allow me to then go do the work? And I think a lot of the conversation so far has been focused on just doing the work. Like we provide, editor, Cody from SourceGraph, let's give him a shout out, but to our developers, and it has some minor impact for some folks in certain scenarios for sure. But we haven't seen this massive, like everyone can do so much more, because again, a big part of the work is not typing things into editors, but understanding what we're trying to build, getting through design, all those sorts of things. And so I think there's a huge amount of potential. I don't think we're seeing it realized just yet. And saying, well, code generation, wasn't quite what we expected, let's just get rid of this whole notion of AI helping us. Like, I think that would be ridiculous. But I think it's going to take us some time to find those, how to make the most of it in these other areas.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really solid take, which is the typing of the code is not the thing. The sort of the figuring out how I'm going to build against this brand new third party that I need to do something with, and getting some sort of like stubbed out things that would previously be the kind of like I'd go and spend a ton of time on Stack Overflow. Like I don't go to Stack Overflow anymore, which is a real shame for Stack Overflow because it was such a pivotal part of my career for such a long time. But I think this is now true of most people, which is, it's certainly not a company which is like, ChatGPT can do a largely better job in those things, and of course it's not socially validated in the same way, and so you have to sort of caveat all that kind of stuff. But I think that is like one big productivity boost, which is like the speed to get the right answer first time, or at least close enough first time, and then to also be able to like shape it by going not quite that, could you do it like this, and it comes back even better, and things that is fast stuff. There's a bunch of really fun ways in which like LLMs have also been helping, which I mean, even me, right? So we have like our product integrates with Slack, right? And so Slack lets you build using this thing called Blockkit, which is essentially like Slack's like proprietary JSON like language for designing modals and messages and stuff. And I saw in our product when I was using it, like a modal, I was like, oh, the design of that looks a bit like average. Normally what I would do here is go rooting through the code to go and find where we generate that JSON and then back that into like Slack's Blockkit builder. And I did this like I was just like, I wonder if I could just screen grab this thing and dump it in ChatGPT and say, produce the block kit like JSON for me that produced this thing. Absolutely nailed it, spot on first time. And so what would have been like however long, to sort of go through that loop of hunting for code just like happened immediately. And I think it's like, I think as we start, like for me, that is now like a really familiar loop, is that I would do things more of that vein that would have previously, kind of to Rob's point, been like felt like toily. Like those things are such a like, they're like these like micro frictions or micro like cuts of all the time that an engineer has. If you think about an engineer working 8 hours a day, if 90 minutes of their day is spent like effing around on like Google trying to find the right answer or like hunting through code to get things, like that's quite a big percentage improvement in time just to get things faster like that. So I think that is broadly it. But yeah, I think it'd be interesting to see how this stuff evolves over time for sure. But yeah.
I was thinking when you mentioned third parties and you previously talked about a problem for future Chris, like the third party might be me from 3 weeks ago. You know what I mean? Like just figuring what was I thinking when I did this? What does this do? How does it work again? Like it might not, we have a lot of developers, multiple different systems and services and that sort of stuff. Like even contextualizing that, right, with your own code base, I think is an accelerant, right? All of these are like, no one's looked at this system for a while, those sorts of things. Really like understanding, summarization, you're exactly right. Those are the things that slow us down, right? Once you actually understand all that and you're like, cool, I need to implement. Yes, there's acceleration to be had there, but it just feels like such a small piece of the puzzle.
Right. No, maybe the way to bring these all together is, I think it is about removing the mundane, the things that do feel wasteful or feel like boilerplate or feel like it takes a lot of time, and getting it so that we can actually spend our human time on the hard part of figuring out what do our customers really need, or what's the experiment to run here, how do we know, and not figuring out what are the right way of structuring the parameters to this particular API call that I'm using or whatever else. And so I think that probably accounts for what are the numbers that we're seeing in terms of speed improvements here.
Yeah,
awesome.
It's really fun. It's really funny actually when I think everyone can kind of have those days where they realize like how frustrating it's been to not be productive. Like other things that come to mind actually that are just like every time catch me out is like when I'm trying to do something on the command line with JQ, like I just want to pass something out of some complex JSON, and I'm like, like what's the thing? And I'm just like, dump the whole thing in ChatGPT, give me the right, and it's just like that stuff. And I think those are actually genuinely very, very meaningful productivity improvements that you can get when you start. But it takes a bit of like forcing yourself into that workflow of thinking like that to get there. And when you do get to that sort of, I mean, it sounds wanky, but like state of enlightenment of like, oh, this is actually a really useful way to have like bouncing these ideas off. Like it starts to fuel more and more of these things. And I think it's really interesting basically. And it like, for me as someone who doesn't really write code anymore, it like applies in sort of all manners of like work, I think. So whether it's writing things or reducing like large bodies of text, it's I mean, it's like, what time to be alive, hey? It's pretty fascinating.
Awesome. Well, I have one more question I'd like to ask the group, and this actually question comes from you, Rob. So it's a question, I guess, for Chris and Eli, and maybe Rob, we'll have you answer as well. But can you think about anything that you folks have implemented that you thought would actually help developer productivity, but ultimately ended up backfiring? And any learnings from that experience?
Oof, that's a good question. Go for it, Eli. You're about to say something.
Yeah, I was about to say something. We certainly have had loops of, I guess I think of it like any kind of product surface area where you're making bets and trying to understand, we think we're going to build this thing and it's going to solve our customer's problem, and does it or doesn't it? So we certainly have had a lot of loops of, hey, it looks like, we have friction in our process of how we have staging environments where we want to, we have data at scale to be able to try stuff out with. And how do we spin those up and do them in a way that works? And so we certainly have gone off and built things that turn out to be actually not helpful or not move the needle or don't solve the problem. I would say pretty routinely. I can't think actually of an example of something that we've like gone hard on, put this thing all the way through and it set us back. So to me, maybe the takeaway from this is to think of this just like we think of product development, all the ways we were talking about it, of moving incrementally, being clear what you're playing for, what is a metric that you're trying to move, How do you do something small and cheap and see if you're moving in the right direction, assume you're wrong the first time, all of that.
Yeah,
Chris,
nothing comes to mind immediately for me. I'm sure there is. I'm sort of racking my brains for something, but I'm very curious, Rob, whether there's like a story behind the question of something that's happened for you that's backfired.
I mean, I have a laundry list, but I would say it's like my favorite question in every context, right? Like I think that a little bit to Eli's tie-in, getting comfortable with failure, with experimentation, all of that is an important part of moving quickly as an organization. And I do think it's on us as leaders to say, hey, I made this call and like that didn't work out, but that's cool. Like, here's what we learned from it. We're better for it, whatever, like really modeling that. And unfortunately, many of the examples that are popping into my head now, because I was like, if I put this on the list, then I'm going to have an answer, are not necessarily things that I was behind. I'm sure I could come up with many. But the one that's top of mind at the moment is, a lot of them are technical, right? Like, hey, let's build systems in this way because that will give people more freedom to execute. And then ultimately we have this really complex thing and everything is slightly different, and we're currently in the process of removing all of our micro front ends. That's an example where we said, oh, everyone will be able to work independently, this will be great, and now we have all, like, to get one thing done you have to put up 10 PRs kind of thing. And so it just did not return on the investment, and now we're, speaking of actually making big sort of technical debt investments, we're rolling all that back out to get back to simpler systems. And I would say, like, anything that is increasing global complexity in the name of sort of local value is always going to be a little bit of a challenge.
Literally, that's one of my favorite topics, is local versus global optimization stuff. So where I used to work before here, they had a full microservices. They were a full microservices shop, right? I joined the company when there were like 200 microservices, and by the time I left, there was like 2,500 or something like that. It was very, very complex application, a bank, microservices, Kubernetes, and I remember people, every time I talk to people, would be like, that sounds like an absolute nightmare to run. And it actually wasn't, because they'd kind of taken a very intentional step to optimize globally. And what they did in this case was essentially say every microservice is built in exactly the same way, in exactly the same language, with exactly the same set of primitives and libraries and which actually meant that it was able to be managed very homogeneously. So if there was an upgrade that needed to be made, my team as the sort of platform team could literally roll out. We routinely did roll out every single service with a new version in the entire cluster. And that was an area where they had very intentionally gone, well, this means that some teams might be locally unhappy that they have to follow a bunch of standards here, and they could probably go faster, right? Maybe a team who has excellent skills in Ruby could go, well, if we built in Ruby, we'd be able to build our little thing a bit quicker. But they'd taken that intentional step to be well, a bunch of teams moving a bit slower for the whole company moving faster in a single direction is actually a really sensible step to take. And I sort of subscribe to that, and I think that is actually, I think that's one of the healthiest things organizations can do. Is it's I think it's the hard move that engineering leaders make, which isn't usually very popular. It's very easy to be popular as an engineering leader and go, yeah, our philosophy here is everyone builds however they want, however they think is fastest, and then you kind of remember that the company outlives every single employee that is at it, and so optimizing for that actually makes a lot more sense. But I love that point.
Yeah, Chris, you've nerd sniped me. I mean, OpsLevel helps engineering teams kind of achieve that kind of standard, and I've seen it again and again where the idea of standards becomes a point of leverage kind of across engineering organizations to help teams move faster. Before working here, I was at Shopify, and they had a very similar mantra. It was like, if you're writing application software, it's in Ruby. If you're writing system tools, it's in Go. You can write it in some new language, but there needs to be a really compelling business case. And I think only Rust, and I might be misquoting that, finally pushed through for some very specific use case that was in one part. So that type of velocity improvement by thinking globally, 100%. I've seen it played out at a bunch of our own customers and previous places where I worked. I do want to be mindful of time. There are so many more questions I would love to ask you guys, but our audience has also put some in the Q&A, and I'd love to get to some of them. Let's just go by some of the top votes here. So the first one is really interesting. The question is from Anonymous. Sometimes it's really easy to see problems in hindsight when you're behind on roadmap commitments, but are there any common leading indicators or warning signs that you have a velocity or productivity problem?
I think one is, I guess, like if you look at this like productivity problem of like how much time am I able to spend being productive, like a good leading indicator would be like where is my reactive time going as a team. And like, without trying to sort of like overly sell the product, this is something that like our product, if you subscribe to the kind of like the notion that like incidents are urgent reactive work, something where you have to drop everything and you can't just throw it on a backlog, and you use a product like an Incident IO or one of many other products that can do sort of similar things, I suppose, then you can start to get a very good handle on like where your time is going, where your like actual engineering time, not wall clock time. But if you've got 5 engineers that have spent time in an incident, for example, that starts to become a good leading indicator, and you can sort of spot if you track that over time, which we do, and I look at. It's probably one of the single things I look at most frequently within our product is like how our teams are doing and which teams are spending more time in that mode of operation. That tends to be a good leading indicator of like, have we taken on too much technical debt? Have we, accidentally fallen into a mode of like firefighting? And those sorts of things tend to be the things that give you an earlier indicator than, oh shit, we didn't deliver half of our roadmap and it's now the end of the quarter.
Eli, Rob, any additional thoughts?
For me, I think it's helpful to even get a level more granular on what kind of velocity problem are you worried about, because I think the leading indicators could be different. And in particular, if you think of kind of there's cultural things like we've talked about around, giving teams the right incentives to be able to experiment quickly, fail, recover. If that's the problem that you're worried about, maybe we're going to get too locked into a big idea and go deep without learning quickly enough. I might look at a different set of things, just see if we are putting stuff into small slices. Look at metrics like epic cycle time or something. Just like, can we define small things, get them done? Can we learn quickly, et cetera? On the other hand, maybe you've got velocity problems that are coming from, we're just not doing enough work, or, we're blocked. We spend too much time in meetings. We're inefficient. We need to different set of measures to make sure that's not going on. Or maybe your velocity problems are stemming from you're actually rushed, working too hard, and you're not thinking about quality, and everything needs to be reworked a zillion times, and you have too many bugs. Like, I would look at a different set of leading indicators for that. So basically my message is kind of get a level crisper on which thing, and it's probably a basket of a bunch of different things to look at.
One other I love both those points, but one other thing that I'm thinking about, because I'm reading the question, is being behind on roadmap commitments, right? Which, like, yes, constant state of every engineering team ever, but then I would ask the question, like, where did those commitments come from? And if I sit down as a team, right, not as a CTO, but if I was on a team and we said, we think we can get that done in this amount of time, and then we can't, then there's a disconnect, right? Which is, one, all engineers believe that everything will take less time, all those things, but like, I am surprised by something along the way. And it might be, to Chris's point, there were incidents and we had to go deal with interruptive work that we didn't plan for. It might be that we don't understand the system well enough to actually make an estimate of what time it's going to take, right? And I'm not saying that everyone has to sign up for like high integrity commitments or whatever, and everything has to have a deadline. But if even on a small scale, I can't say this feels like it should take about this amount of time and actually have that happen, then there's something about my ability to deliver that's impeding me, right? And it could be system understanding, it could be understanding the problem, it could be a million other things. But if we can't regularly say that seems like a small thing and have it actually be a small thing, then start there. All you get out of that is, I have a problem. Now you need to go have some conversations to figure out what's causing that. But I do think, I'm like caging everything a little bit, but some kind of predictability at small scale of just saying, yeah, that's easy, and it's actually easy. If I can't make that happen, there's some conversation to be had.
There's
to
some
figure
deeper
out
things there.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, let's move on to the next question. So the DORA report landed yesterday, and quote, transformational leaders increase productivity. So how are you measuring leadership metrics specifically, right? This person's curious to hear how other leaders are assessing the culture and how it impacts productivity.
I'll start on this one. I would say two things. One of the greatest challenges of going from like an IC software developer to a leader is, as an IC software developer, your feedback loops are measured in milliseconds, right? Like, I run the unit test and the thing that I built, and as a leader of a large organization, it's measured in quarters if you're super lucky, right? Years more likely. But not to cop out, we do, organizational engagement surveys and things like that, where I'm happy to say we have a fairly high level of comfort in the organization commenting on what people like and don't like about leadership, what they understand and don't understand about the work that they're trying to do. I feel bad that I didn't notice that the report came out yesterday. I've not read it, but reading that line, like understanding, do people have what they need in order to do their jobs, feels like a big part of that, right? And, there's some question, I don't know if we're going to get to them all, but like how we as leaders engage with the topic of productivity and help our teams engage with that topic in a way that feels safe and appropriate. And like, I want to be a high performing engineer, product manager, whatever that might be. And I'm excited about having this feedback versus this is the tool that everyone's using to measure my performance and they're going to make it about me kind of thing. Like, a big part of that comes down to leadership and how leaders use that information, do that in a transparent, open way, talk about what action they're taking as a result of the feedback that they've collected. I think without that, people make up their own stories about what's happening with that information. And, you have to make that very public and be accountable as a leader to taking action, right? To doing something with the information to make people's lives easier, to make their jobs easier, to help them excel at the work and clear the blockers and the clutter.
Eli, I love your take on it as the representative from Jellyfish, whose product helps many teams measure specific metrics.
Yeah. I mean, my answer to metrics for leaders is actually kind of similar to my answer for metrics for individuals, ICs, engineers, which is to say there isn't a metric that tells you if this person is good at their job or not. I mean, it's a very contextual, qualitative thing. It takes time to understand. I do think data is a great beginning of a conversation about those things, and seeing especially changes over time. Are things moving? Is things different and worse? Is this different from that for reasons that I understand? Is really helpful. So bringing data to bear in the conversations with leaders about all this stuff, about how productive our teams, what's the velocity of which we're shipping stuff, how much value is delivered, all this kind of, how happy are people, what are the sentiments and engagement surveys, do people feel supported? All of this, I think, is part of the conversation. But if the question asker is asking for, like, I want something that gives me a scorecard for my director that can say if they're doing a good job or not, like, I wish it were that simple. I don't think there is one.
And Chris, any final thoughts?
I don't think I have anything super meaningful to add here. I don't have any metrics or anything. I think, like for me personally, like feel like in a small enough organization with 30, 40 engineers that I think you can be relatively plugged into like how the kind of the vibes and the culture across your organization in a way that is a lot easier than when you have hundreds and hundreds of engineers and knowing what your impact of your actions are on them. But I don't know. I'm very curious. I sort of agree with Rob that I feel bad I haven't read this, but I feel like I should go and read it now and get a better perspective.
Awesome. Well, we are at time. So I wanted to, Eli, Chris, and Rob, just thank each of you for joining us on the panel today. To all of our listeners, again, we recorded the session, so we're going to be sending the recording out. And really, guys, it has been absolutely great. This was such an amazing discussion, and I learned a lot as a leader, and I'm going to take some of these lessons back to my own team. And so just really thank you all for participating today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to meet you all.
Yeah.
All right. Happy building, everybody. Bye.